I hope each group could talk for about 5 minutes or so on the discussion, and then perhaps we'll have some general discussion in the audience as well. So Keith, please come and tell us about new theories.
All right. So yeah, we solved ours. I hope everybody else did theirs. So yeah, the session was ostensibly about new theories, and sort of led off by asking, well, if we're getting into new theories, what's the current theories? And actually weren't really even able to sort of pin that down. So one observation I think I came out with was that in the absence of I'd say a new theory is sort of a faith that if we can solve this data and modeling thing, that the new theories will emerge out of that. So there was a lot of discussion, obviously, about data and access to data, the nature of data, and difficulty surrounding that, the realities of where we are currently. And then we sort of concluded by trying to develop a diagram that sort of had the idea of data as sort of the base of an idea to build upon. And then on top of the data is modeling. And we spent a lot of time talking about, just the distinctions between abstract models and sort of more, could I say, goal-oriented models. Ideas about the importance of both of those types of models and how they relate to each other, and then through that modeling process, the development of knowledge. So that's a very sort of broad simplification. I'd encourage anybody in the group that was involved in that to add to that characterization without getting back into the full discussion again. So anyway, anybody want to add to that something important that obviously I really glossed over? But clearly there's plenty of work to do, and there's in terms of the question of whether or not this constitutes a domain or a discipline that would have a lot of vital interest. It's clear to me from the discussions that it clearly is there. Okay. All right.
Okay, hi. I think we also had a good discussion. I don't think we didn't solve the problems either. I think the reason why I'm here, all the way from Helsinki, Finland, is that we are actually trying to now set up a course on urban systems and smart cities. And IBM will have a role there. Practically, it's going to be me. So I'm here also to learn. And I would say that this discussion we just had with very distinguished people there and experts and professors in universities definitely gave a lot of help, at least personally for me, so that how we can set up this course so that it's going to be a good one. Finland has done something brave, which I think links very well to this discussion here, is that what we took our 3 biggest universities, the University of Technology, Business, and Art and Design, and merged them into one big university last year to drive multidisciplinary research. I think it's very relevant for this topic, which is extremely, I would say, multidisciplinary on smart cities and urban systems. There was talk about, for example, that maybe we shouldn't have a master's program on urban systems, but just instead on urban design, what has have existed before as well, but infuse and add into that many of the elements we've discussed here today and yesterday on technology, system thinking, design thinking. There was also a lot about a consensus that the education should be maybe problem focused instead of just maybe scratching the surface on this very broad topic. There was discussion and good experiences from MIT on the studio models, where they have created these studios where students are, gathering and solving problems in a very concrete way. Good ideas on and visions on how universities will maybe have more and more centers of research in the future that can be much more agile than the universities themselves. The centers of research can adapt, have for example topics related to smart cities, urban systems. Good examples from Spain, where students have been innovating with the city. I think Michael told the audience about this yesterday. There was some, I think, good also talk from Anthony and his own experiences in MIT, where he basically, after his PhD on topics, on smart cities, urban systems, he couldn't really find a place for himself, and what that means, that probably similar things in many other universities as well. Also talk about that students would become creators with responsibility to suggest solutions to the city. And I think this is something we're going to do, at least in Helsinki, to really drive the cooperation between the university and the city, and hopefully both will benefit. I think that's about it, what I have here in my notes. Anybody from the group want to add anything? We mainly talked about the education in the universities, not that much of the profession development.
A couple of times yesterday we I think touched on education in a even more general sense, although that heading was really focused about education specifically for people interested in this area. But I wondered if you had any discussion about, for example, the need to introduce the idea of modeling more in general education as a high school topic, for example.
There was some discussion there, and there was some cautionary tales. I think it was from Esri there on the models. If you want to say something, go ahead there. But I personally do believe we continue that over the lunch, that yes, maybe for example, modeling, at least in my opinion, is something, or optimization, they are something that you should be taught more in the future. But we really didn't go that deep on those topics. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. I also had a very lively group to moderate, but my group is very action-oriented, so I think we came up with a couple of key actions, and we've broken them down into 5 discrete things. First thing was communication. So how are we going to do this? Who's talking to each other, and how are we talking to each other? It was a theme that we heard throughout this entire symposium. First thing that we thought we need to do is find a key node to connect the people and the ideas. A couple of ideas were floated around, one of those being IBM City Forward. The other one, UN Habitat is engaging in this work. And finally, the World Urban Campaign is also engaging in this work. So we need to find a key focal point. We felt that this was very key to this. Also, a bibliography of references would be extremely helpful. We had many different disciplines around the table, referencing different people, thinkers, ideas. Finding one key place where you can go to, these are the 5 books that you should read for this topic would be really helpful to get everybody kind of on the same page, talking the same language. One of the other key things, commissioning an article on urban informatics. And I'm going to call out Jeannie Birch and Bob Schloss, who had a good interchange on this. That's something that felt would be a key idea for this moving forward. Get that key article written on that, since it does not yet exist. Also, finding the foundations that are willing to help fund some of this work. We have some of the foundations here today, but there's definitely many more that should be part of this conversation. And finally, identifying who's not here. There's several of us here, but there's many more who are not able to be here. Hopefully more are joining from the web. So those are the key communication actions. The next one was privacy. We'll definitely need to figure out the privacy issues. IBM noted they have a paper on this coming out within the next 5 months, and we discussed HIPAA and different models. Maybe we need to talk to healthcare to figure out how they got that passed and what we can learn from the healthcare field. Third point was metrics. We need to figure out and decide and agree on a standard for what we're measuring. which relates to the fourth one, which is methods. We need to find a common language for how we're measuring these things to make sure that the data has quality to it. And finally, the fifth was an agenda for how we move forward. So we definitely, I think, as a group agree that this is important. It's important for us to continue this process moving forward. And hopefully we'll be able to set an agenda maybe within the next couple minutes after we give our report backs. But we also had a couple of questions. So like any of these conversations, ended up going around in many circles and not really coming to any answers in an hour and a half. So some of those that we wanted to capture was, it's really important that we as a group discuss who the client is, and there could be many clients, but you know, is it the general public? Is it other firms? I mean, it's probably, as one of the other speakers said, and. But we need to hammer that out, and also we need to understand why we're doing this. And one of the comments that I'd like to leave with came up in the group, and somebody said, you know, we're trying to do this to make better decisions and also make better policies for cities. So if we can leave with that maybe as a closing thought, and I have the action items, we'll post those online. So thanks.
I learned early on that IBM really likes PowerPoint, so I took a moment to. So inevitably, we talk about financing. We're getting into the nitty-gritty, right? So our group was a great discussion and very focused. I think there are a few themes that came around, but eventually this was around the charge of how do we take these visionary ideas? How do we take these ideas and actually make them reality and implement them? How do we take these models and make something physical out of them? So there was a few issues that I think came up and themes across the 2 days that relate back to investment decision-making analysis, which is really what we're considering here in terms of capital markets and capital constraints. The first, of course, is time, and how do you link operations and planning? And part of this is how do you overcome what are relatively usually short-term investment horizons, which are either dictated by political cycles or investor cycles and investor limitations, with kind of life cycle analysis and life cycle cost impacts and benefits. Another is scale. We talked a lot about we need scale. We need to build new cities. We need to significantly add to the ones we have. That requires a lot of money. And so where do we get this money from is a key consideration, particularly in terms of constraints that we're facing at the local level, the city, municipal level in terms of funding. Communication has been another common theme, and it seems that kind of these metrics and this discussion is really a key kind of communication factor and perhaps language barrier. That understanding of investment kind of decisions or investment language and the metrics behind it is not something universally understood, especially when we get to some of the design and planning professions that typically understand this but don't necessarily deal with it on a day-to-day basis. So how we actually ingrain that conversation a little bit. And of course, the last that we're concerned about and where the models come into play is really this idea of risk. So predicting risk, mitigating it, so having mitigation strategies to minimize risk that we know may in some form occur. And then also how do we allocate risk? So it's not just a matter of getting rid of risk. We can never reduce risk entirely, but we can shift who bears the cost, who bears the benefits. One very practical application I think ties in terms of how do we access capital and how can we begin to do this. Tax increment financing is a way that local governments, as you guys all know, as a way to fund new infrastructure projects that are then paid for by the subsequent development that occurs around it. And as I was watching Bill Miller's presentation, it struck me this is one way to link the models and the finance, very, very directly, actionable kind of way. That as we were layering in the LRT lines and everything, that you could immediately see and predict and estimate the value proposition of the properties surrounding it and begin to capture that value while also layering in the cost of those changes. One thing that was dramatically missing from my perspective was how much it cost to run that line and what the implications were. But you could add that fourth dimension into this and begin to look at cost and revenue structures. So the way forward, not so much from an organizational point of view, but in terms of things that actionable items, obviously this issue of data is critical. And from the building real estate perspective and the kind of investment community, there's a lot more of it happening, so this is occurring. We need to link these prediction optimization models back to the cost and revenue structures. Perhaps exploring flexibility as a risk mitigation strategy in a way to reduce some of these first cost capital requirements. You know, the very interesting things in terms of option pricing that are available, kind of if we think about flexible buildings, buildings that could be added onto that was discussed yesterday, as market conditions change, as infrastructure conditions change, this is a way to add value and capture new value as we go. looking at new capital sources, so getting the private sector involved, not just through public-private models, but others, and then using these models also to more efficiently create demand pricing and yield management strategies as a way that you could capture, from operational perspective, capture added value and then use that to invest in things that have a longer-term payback horizon and a longer-term benefit horizon. And so obviously, as we go into this discussion, we really need to broaden it. I think, I'm biased, but kind of the real estate investment community really needs to be part of this discussion to get to that implementation stage. And then there's also, it wasn't brought up too much over the past 2 days, but really looking at how all this affects low-income and distressed communities that are suffering even more dramatic capital constraints. So this kind of question of willingness to pay for some of these improvements to the ability to pay constraints, and how we actually are able to provide these technologies and infrastructures in places that don't necessarily can't kind of tap into the same kind of private resources that others might. Would the group, anyone in the group like to add anything? I think I covered most of the bases, so thank you very much. Yes?
So are these things, this list of things you have here, are these things that somebody ought to do, or are these things that the group decided the group would like to do?
Somebody in terms of, we have a choice to put it on someone else? Or, I think these are things that need to be looked at, that a group, this group that that we're not created yet, that is in creation, could begin to look at these in a way that, jointly kind of look at these things and interactively look at these.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much. And John?
Thanks. Well, we had another great discussion. Synthesizing it was only slightly less onerous than synthesizing this morning's panel. But same level of vitality. So we had governance, and in some ways it was posed as a question, how does intelligent technologies, data analytics change the process of governance? And we almost took that as we took that as accepted and tried to put more nuance to it. What was interesting during the discussion is it occurred to us at a certain point that civic engagement, you could replace the word governance in most of the ways we were talking with the term civic engagement, which are not the same things, but it became this idea that the data-enabled, digital facilitated civic engagement is a kind of distributed governance, and that informed the challenges and the opportunities that we laid out. The first challenge to really affecting a kind of sort of revolution in governance that you see pieces of is data literacy. This is brought up a number of times over the last 2 days, but specifically among political leaders. Some suggestions were made for that. I mean, not many city halls have a statistician or a data scientist on staff. There were some really good suggestions for how to go about that. Partnerships with civic organizations whose jobs do not depend on obfuscating data, which when sometimes it does exist in a city, that's how it goes. Or partnerships with academia who are experts. So data literacy, that's the number one, and we will post these. The second is how to motivate citizens to participate. I forget who brought it up yesterday, but the delicious model of start with personal utility that aggregates up to civic or social utility. Another one which I call the rise of DIMBYism, which is if you make the data hyper-local enough, people will care and take action on it, and we're only just getting down to that level. And the other, which we're only just seeing, is basically taking the pessimist view, which is we can engage people if we make the technology autonomic enough, which is to say you don't have to think about it. The city of Boston recently released a pothole app that actually doesn't require you to take a photo of it. It uses the accelerometer in your phone, and when it feels a bump, it tags it with GPS and sends it on to the city, who then disambiguates and aggregates and essentially crowdsources all these points to say that's not a pothole, that's a speed bump, and then can go after it. The third one, and this one's tough. I don't know that we have a solution to this, but it might as well be laid out as a challenge, is how to make this city data feeds a performance metric. How to make it matter in the budgeting process. Even some, what I consider one of the most forward-thinking cities in this space, Portland, that's a sometime proposition. So in addition to making it easier for a citizen to do something or interact with the city, it really needs that structural infusion into how the agencies are rated. This one is not solved, but it's one of my favorite threads to come out of the last couple days, actually, is the tension between making decisions based on values and making decisions based on data. I mean, I was so happy to hear Mayor Miner yesterday kind of, give us a slap in the face. That's a thread worth exploring. I think it's a bit of both, and we had both extremes over the last 2 days. A sort of personal concern of mine, how do we move beyond e-government, that more than 10-year-old phrase? In other words, how do we not simply electrify old processes? It's not that much less of a pain to pay your parking ticket online than it is to pay it in line. Although many governments will say, we're digital now for doing that. Well, okay, but how about using what is increasingly becoming a networked streetscape to prevent the parking tickets in the first place, or to make it easier for you to find parking? That's a true revolution in the citizen-government relationship. And then the last challenge to this, I think, is we're only just now seeing it because we've kind of been punch drunk on open data for the last couple of years, is the unintended consequences of open data. There are a lot of these. I think the one that was most shocking to me a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, I took a tour of the MTA command center here. And what they noted is that now that there are signs popping up on the platforms that show when the train's coming, which is a bit late to come to New York as opposed to some other cities, it's actually made the network of trains a little less flexible because they're unwilling to irritate a platform full of people who now have an expectation set by taking trains out of service, putting them on the express tracks and sending them elsewhere to alleviate some sort of problem. And this is a totally unintended consequence. So they're trying to figure out. They said there's a PhD to be written in here somewhere of what is the minimum time in the future that you can pull a train out of service and not have a riot on your hands on the platform. So the opportunities, though, I mean, many of these are self-evident and run through everything we've discussed these last 2 days. And thanks to Joe for really crystallizing these. Why do we want to do this? Why do we want data, as, for instance, to be a big part of our governance? Is analysis and understanding, planning and design, management, behavior change, empowerment, an empowerment agenda, and even market development, using open data as a kind of natural resource or public resource that businesses can be built upon. A lot of times we forget that weather data was not a standard, was not a national standard until a couple of decades ago, and look where we are now. You've got entire cable channels based on essentially an open data standard. This can happen as well. So I'll leave you with a comment that Nicholas made that I sort of love, is that he noted that architects, when the PC first came out, and even today, think of digital technology as the computer, as the box. And often, if they use it at all, it's in the design process. It's to design something that looks self-consciously computer design, something that, Frank Gehry comes to mind. But that the real place-making revolution with digital technologies is the disappearance of the computer into the environment. Thinking of the street itself as the computing platform, the street and public transit, which have long had a role in the relationship between the public and their government. Think of Cairo, think of Rosa Parks. These elements of public infrastructure have always been locuses of interaction. And when we infuse that with digital technology, I think you speed those feedback loops up. So.